Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Wright Human, cartoonist extraordinaire. I am the community outreach manager for the Columbus Cartoon Coalition, and we are here as part of our continuing C3 Anthology adventure. We are interviewing the creators that are involved in the Columbus Cartoon Coalition's most recent anthology, which we will be doing a campaign to fund, I believe, starting on August 14th through Crowdfunder. And as part of that, we have with us today Chandu Tennety. Chandu has been a member of the group for a while and is actually contributing to two parts of this anthology, both Project 2, Cartoonist Life, and Project 3, Coalition of Comics. How are you doing today, Chandu?
Doing great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So how long exactly have you been with C3? Do you know?
That's a good question. I want to say um, at least a year, if not more.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, I just realized I have it up. Your introduction post was actually about a year and a half ago. You've been part of the
Perfect.
group for a pretty long time. That would
Yeah.
have put you at one of the first members.
It was pretty early on. I remember Sydney talking about it. I believe I caught it either at Space or at CXC, one of the two. And I was like, oh, this is great. I need to see how I can get in on this.
Absolutely. How long have you been doing comic stuff?
Not not super long. So I've been like, I'm an avid reader. I grew up reading newspaper comics. Like I wasn't a collector necessarily, but
Mhm.
just syndicated comics and funnies in the Sunday papers. And yeah, so that was big influence on, the Beetle Baileys and the Phantom and, those kinds of things. And then, always had like a sort of fascination with, DC comics. I didn't, or like Batman primarily,
Mhm.
like most folks. So yeah, so it was more about like when I could get hands on stuff, just try and read them, and so I wasn't like an aficionado, or like I don't have boxes of back issues or anything. But you know, one thing led to another, and kind of a few years ago, started with contributing to the Scribbler,
Mhm.
um, which is the local comics magazine, and also attended. Oh yeah, I think what really set things into motion was like I found out about Space in like 2015, and went and attended Space, and I was like, had a fantastic experience, and I was like, okay, I should get more involved in the community.
Yeah. I have to ask, just because you're talking about growing up on newspaper comics and Batman and all of that, and I feel a little weird asking this, so I apologize in advance. Are you out of like based on your accent? I'm trying to place where exactly you're from. Um,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I grew up in India, so like yeah.
the reason I wonder is I actually have a friend who was a cartoonist from India, Shashwat
Okay.
Mishra, and one of the things he used to talk about a lot is that the comic scene out there is very interesting. He did an entire presentation to us. I want to say it was basically on um, knockoff superhero comics that were sort of part of the evolution of a lot of the stuff that happened. He also talked about uh, comics based on Hindu myths and things like that as being a big
Yes.
part of it.
Yeah.
So, what was the scene like there growing up? I mean, it sounds like you had a lot of the same newspaper comics.
Yeah. I mean, I moved out, you know, during like in my 20s, like
Hmm.
I moved to the US. So, growing up, it was, again, like I said, I wasn't like a hobbyist or anything. So like a lot of it was, like you're saying, like mostly newspaper comics, but then every so often, like, we would get our hands on the, the knockoff superhero comics, or like
Hmm.
compiled, so what folks would do is like scan in strips from the newspaper and compile it as like a comic, so you could buy those. So like there were, they were not syndicated or licensed or anything.
Yeah.
There was a company called Indrajal, and like they would put together these comic magazines. And so like, got my taste there. And then there was also the local ones that, it was, yeah, so that's based on the mythologies of the
Yeah.
time. So again, like, when I could get my hands on it, just for entertainment, but like I wasn't a huge collector.
Right.
So most of my interest was in like I don't know, the art really fascinated me, and
Hmm.
so I would try and emulate it myself. Like I so this is a funny story, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so like where I grew up, like the apartment building I was in, like the walls and floor and all were made of like basically concrete, like poured concrete, right?
Hmm.
And so the floor was, it was a large chalk drawing surface, essentially like a giant blackboard. So instead of like paper and pencil, like which was more resources, like we just had chalk laying around, so like I would just draw on the floor, and like yeah, so I would draw, Disney characters and these like Phantom and Mandrake or whatever, like these comic characters.
Yeah.
So that was my level of enthusiasm there.
Yeah,
Um,
that's incredible. Like you always see things about kids drawing on the walls. You
right.
actually were chalking up the floor. It's fantastic.
Yep. Yep. And and then my parents would toss me a rag to clean up after myself, and that was it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So did it start with art for you, or story, or writing and storytelling?
it was definitely art.
Hmm.
And writing is still not. I mean, I loved writing in English and composition, but like telling stories, longer form stories, was not necessarily a strength. I mean, I could, I could like do free association or poems or like that kind of thing. I could like write short essays, but like never really went too deep into like writing short stories or even anything longer. But my whole, like, what excited me was being able to put stuff into pictures. So like if somebody else had a story, I would want to illustrate it, right? And like my brother fancied himself a writer, like he had a book published, and so like he would write all the time, and like he would read it to me, and I would be like, I'm going to draw this, and like so that was my thrill, really.
Yeah. Have you done any official collaboration with your brother?
No, I have not. It's yeah, he yeah. I mean, the writing piece, like he published his book like a few years ago. It's like a collection of short stories. So like I've wanted to in the past, but like yeah, it never materialized.
Back burner projects. We all got them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you came to Columbus, and last few years have been involved with things like the Scribbler, going to space, all of that. Uh, Tell me about your first comic project.
Um, yeah. Okay, so most of right. So most of my contributions so far have been like one shots or like so old comics like that Bob Corby puts
Yeah.
out. So I collaborated with my daughter and like
Hmm.
made two different submissions to that anthology, to Yo Comics anthology. And in fact, like one of those was like the longest one I had done, like was like 6 pages long,
Hmm.
and it was based on a story that my daughter wrote. So I hadn't done anything much longer than that. But uh, like a couple of years ago, uh, I've been kind of on the lookout for story ideas. Like I'm wanting to do something longer.
Hmm.
So, but then this idea came along, and so I'm trying to like put that into like a longer form story. So I've been working on this off and on for like a few years. I haven't, or several months, I should say, but like I haven't officially announced it. So this is basically the first time I'm talking about it
Hmm.
outside of just my immediate family and friends. But yeah, it's called All Our Monsters,
Hmm.
and the premise of it is around generational trauma and the healing of it. So yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in any way, like, but like there's just been a lot of that going around, I feel like, over the last couple of years, and
Hmm.
a lot of that has kind of come to the surface. And so yeah, this is set in like a fantasy world where basically every few generations there is a generation that's born that's capable of healing, or that's capable of sensing and healing that trauma. And so like the story follows like a a teen in that generation and how that power manifests within them.
That's an awesome idea. And yeah,
Thank you.
like uh, talking about things as important as generational trauma. My first thought was memoir comics, which are one of the things that comics are weirdly uniquely suited for,
Yes.
better than just about anything else. I've
Yeah.
never entirely understood why, but they really are. But yeah, that sounds like a great. I love the multi-generate. The one of the things that's nice about fantasy is you can kind of also tackle issues that are a lot harder to talk about because there's a little bit of that extra distance.
Right, right.
Yeah.
That was my rationale in trying to set it in the fantasy world. One, like, so you can, because we know monsters exist in that world. Like, readers wouldn't be surprised to see monsters show up,
Yeah.
right? And but then what the monster represents is not immediately clear in the beginning.
Mhm.
So like the reader kind of learns about it as they, as the story progresses.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Are you looking at this being a full graphic novel, a web comic, something serialized, anything like that?
So I am planning it in issues, like, so basically chapters that are like 20-ish pages long.
Hmm.
So I'm not totally sure. I don't think I can make a web comic out of it, like, because the pages are, I'm using a grid, and like I'm using like a comic page. So I would have to do some finagling to make it work with like a scrollable format. So I don't know that I'm there yet, but
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm hoping to like finish up, you know, illustrating one issue, then like start promoting it or like talking about it more, and see how people react, before going on. So I have like a total of like 7 issues, or maybe 7 issues and the prologue kind of
Hmm.
thing. And then I have the script for like 2 of them. So like I'm working on the script for the third one, but then like I'm working on illustrating the first one still.
Yeah, that's always how it goes. You want to have a backlog before you release everything and all that.
Yeah.
So seven, you're saying you have 7 issues so far, or that's how long you think the story's going to be?
I think that's how it's going to be, how long it's going to be.
Nice.
Yeah. So
That's very manageable roadmap.
that's
As a guy who's done 2 graphic novels, that sounds so doable.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that, because like, yeah, I have no idea what I'm
yeah.
doing.
It's
It's
scary at
like,
first, right?
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, one of the things I always recommend to people, especially if they're intimidated by longer stories and things like that, um, just once, even if you don't succeed, try 24-hour comic day.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Just like the first time I did it, I finished my 24-hour comic in 9 days. So it took me way longer than
Yeah.
I failed the goal. But then I realized I just did a 25-page comic in 9 days, and all of a sudden it made the idea of writing longer way easier. So
Yeah.
I usually
Yeah.
recommend everyone try it at least once
I
because
love that idea. I
yeah.
mean, and I think I'm definitely struggling with like, what I think of as like local optimization. Like, I'm basically tunnel visioning into each page, and I'm trying to make it like really good, and like, it's taking me a long time, and less time than it would otherwise take me. I've like
Mhm.
worked on my process, and like submitting to the anthologies and the scribblers helped with that, like, so that I'm faster than I used to be.
Yeah.
But still, like, I feel like there's got to be a faster way to do this. Like, so yeah, that's a great tip.
Yeah. That's one of the things that you just kind of figure out over time. Like
Yeah.
it's one of the things that's really going to be frustrating is by the time you finish issue 7, you'll be looking back at the art at issue 1 and you're like, why did I do
Right.
that?
Yeah.
And you just have to get used to
Exactly.
the fact that's going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, it's painful looking at the prologue of my first book because by the time I finish it, I'm like, the last page looks better than the first page, and that just got to live with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get that. But
Um,
I mean, to your point earlier about memoir comics, like that's I really enjoy like slice of life or
mhm.
memoir style of comics for, you know and I think it works because like you don't have to say many words to get,
Yeah.
the feeling across, and and sometimes, in fact, like it's even cooler when the words are actually dissonant with what's on the page, right? Like you show something but then say something totally different, and like it's an interesting way to get your point across, I think.
Yeah, I definitely get that. I know for me, another part is I've never particularly liked autobio in general.
Yeah,
My main exposure to it was books, and so many autobio things felt very narcissistic on some level.
100%.
Um,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
remember discovering comic memoirs and going, "Why don't I get the same feeling?" And I realized it's because the I've never met a cartoonist who thought they were awesome. Like every cartoonist I know is self-deprecating,
Right, right, right.
and like somehow that works.
Yeah,
Like I actually believe them when they say they want to tell a story that has to do with something real that happened to them.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
And
you mentioned your daughter was helping you with some of the storytelling. You got a budding cartoonist there?
I wish, like, I mean, she's a really good artist in her own right, but like she's much more focused on the writing aspect. She wants to be a writer when she grows up, and so like the story that I mentioned, the specific one was she like entered a competition called Power of the Pen that happens in Ohio for school going kids, and yeah, and she won, like she made it all the way to like the state competent state level, and one of the submissions that she wrote was a short story
Mhm.
about this marionette. And when and it was all prose, like when I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, this just would be amazing to draw as a comic. So it's basically all silent except for like 3 or 4 panels where there's words, and those words are actually spoken by the puppet, like the marionette puppet. So it's like slightly verging on the supernatural, and like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
just a really cool idea. So
And she's already figured out how not to overwrite, it sounds like, if she did a silent uh,
yeah,
project.
yeah, she's really working on her
Yeah.
craft, and I
Uh,
think, yeah.
are you comfortable telling us how old she is?
Yes, so she's 15. She turns 16 this year.
Gotcha.
So
She's
yeah,
almost old enough to be joining the Discord server. Like,
right.
get in with the writers there.
I wish. Yeah, I mean, I'll float it by her. Like we
Yeah.
might have another member here soon. So
Yeah.
yeah.
How is she about taking feedback? Has she learned that trick yet?
It's there's good days and bad days. So yeah, no, actually, she was pretty happy with whatever, like this particular collaboration. There was another one earlier where the theme was chaos, and she's like, yes, this is right down my alley, and she like wrote a whole thing, and I was like, okay, look, I have 4 pages, I have to abridge this somewhat, and like and I want to show not tell.
Yeah.
And she's like, she wasn't happy with it. She's like,
Yeah.
no, I want all the words on there. I'm like, well, so
Yeah.
we had to have a little bit of a
That
bargaining.
is definitely a struggle I've had with writers before.
Right.
Because I remember there was one thing I was trying to do that was just a 1 page punchline, and I was talking to a friend because it was kid dialogue, and I don't have any kids. My friend is a writer who has kids. I went to him for advice, and the problem was that he wrote like a page of dialogue. I'm like, no, the kid says one line. Like, I need you to.
Oh,
This is the basic art. I just need one line of dialogue.
right. Right. That is a hard sell. I mean,
Yeah,
but yeah, that's a great point too. Like I found that, while I was writing this comic, is to like, because there's so much you can do like with visuals, like I really needed to pare down the dialogue. Like I'm
yeah,
like, I don't need this person to like talk in paragraphs. How can I make it fit in like 2 lines in a word bubble, and like,
yeah.
yeah.
What does your writing process look like? Do you script beforehand, or is it?
Yeah, I have been with this work. Yeah, I have been scripting beforehand. Like, so what I did, at least like, um, when exploring the idea first, like I just wrote notes, like a ton
Mhm.
of notes. Like, spent some time doing world building, spent some time, with characters or whatever. I could have probably gone further with the characters and like done the whole wants, needs, and all of that layout, but
Mhm.
I didn't have a system for that. And I was like, okay, I know my main characters relatively well. I'm gonna write some stuff down. So yeah, but then like I had to decide, okay, what kind of world is it? Is it like a sci-fi? Is it
Mhm.
fantasy? Is it current like modern world? And so did some brainstorming around that. Once I had made some decisions there, then I was like, okay, I'm gonna start writing. And so, and to your point earlier, like I found it easier to think in terms of issues and be like, okay, what can I do with 20 pages, right? And how
Right.
much can I tell? And then like in those 20 pages, I need like, basically like a 3 act structure, and so I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, let's fill the first act with some, like exposition, not necessarily, but like some setting the scene, right? And then take it from there and see how it evolves, kind of. um, yeah, but definitely it scripted the whole thing. But when it came to illustrating it, I was like, okay, now I can take some license with some of these pages and yeah, change the
Yeah.
pacing or whatever.
Yeah. I've definitely found whenever I'm doing a longer story, the thumbnailing stage is really the main writing stage. Like
Yeah,
I may have scripted everything out, but so much gets changed and cut as soon as you start drawing it because you realize, oh, pacing wise, this isn't going to fit,
yeah,
or like I'm not going to have room for this entire huge block of dialogue.
right.
Yeah.
This is
Um,
true.
I had a fun project I remember a while back where I'd written the entire comic with basically superhero comic, almost like Frank Miller, uh, like narrative boxes through the entire thing.
Yeah.
And I had someone look at it and like, try doing this comic silent. And I did, and it was way better. It
Oh,
just cut most of pretty much everything there. And it was like, yeah, it's
yep.
amazing how well this stuff can work if you just uh, tweak it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that feedback is great to have too, like somebody to, and that was one of my goals, is to like
Mhm.
start sharing it early. Like, so I drew out the first issue and I was like,
Mhm.
okay, I need some beta readers. Like, I'm just gonna hand it to people, not tell them much about the premise, like, and get
Yeah.
feedback from that. And that was like really useful.
Yeah.
So
That's hard to do for a lot of people. It's a very useful thing to do.
yeah, yeah, I highly recommend it. Like,
Yeah.
and it's like, I write software for a living, and so like, it's like the cost of change is high. So
Hmm.
like, the sooner you can get it in front of people with like, minimal effort, like not, scribbles necessarily or napkin drawings, but like get it presentable, but
Yeah.
like not too well done, and so that it's easier to still change, right? And yeah, so
Yeah. Like that's always the nightmare is like, oh, I've already gotten through pencils and inks and color. I need to change something massive. Well, now I can't
right, right,
without doing a ton of work.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so yeah, it's definitely something worth figuring out. I think one of the big skills for people when they're starting to put their work out there is um, all feedback, even the toxic stuff, is useful to hear, and not all feedback is something you have to take. And that's
mm,
like something really hard for a lot of people to figure out. And it's
yeah,
always and also like don't take any of it personally, which is
that
that's
is
the
so
part that
hard.
people have trouble with.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh, you mentioned software stuff. Is that what you went to school for?
Um, I did not. I went to school for industrial engineering, but like I had to do some software as part of that. And then yeah, just a long story, ended up in the programming world. So yeah, by day I work for an insurance company. Actually, I'm an engineering manager now, so I don't do as much code. I just like my yeah, basically try to help my folks write the code.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can kind of tell just because the attention to detail you've described in your comic work very
Appreciate
much seems like someone who's used to reading through code to find the one line that got wrong.
it. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Um. So with C3, you've
Yeah.
been coming to. I've seen you at a lot of the events. I've seen you. Uh, active in the chat and doing things like that. What do you think of this community? Like, feel free to be honest.
Oh my gosh, I'm like just happy to be here. Like it's really amazing to just be witness, like be a fly on the wall on the
Mhm.
community. And like, I mean, I know there's a lot of folks there who are like CCAD and associated folks, and it's yeah, I mean, I don't have that background, but like um I don't feel like excluded because of it or anything. So
Yeah.
like, I feel like I can jump into conversations and like, get really good feedback. I've posted, my art in there, or like, even my writing, and like Jack Wallace, who you
Yeah.
or Kelsey interviewed yesterday or 2 days ago, um, left some really good feedback on that, and yeah, just fantastic resource. And the tips and advice channel alone is like, you know, yeah, it is amazing.
Yeah. One of the things that has been interesting because I'm a transplant to Columbus. I've been here since
Yeah,
like 2017, and finding this group was amazing because it was really hard with finding groups of cartoonists because we tended to all be doing
yeah,
our own thing, and it's a community that this particular community is very good about being positive and open and something for everybody who wants to be involved in this stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, and Sydney is great. Like, and I know there have been like some flare ups of, opinions, and it always gets smoothed over. And like,
Yeah. It's
people,
artists.
yeah,
Artists every once
yeah,
in a while get,
yeah,
yeah, it happens.
right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, yeah, no
Yeah.
complaints. Like,
I,
and
I imagine you often have the same thing that I do with feeling like the old guy in the room, but all these
I
college
just,
kids.
oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And like, as somebody who's starting in the industry, like relatively late, so yeah, I mean, I'm like, these guys, these folks are like fresh out of college, and like they're out there putting their work, launching Kickstarters and promoting their work, and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, and I'm here still intimidated about, you know, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's all intimidating, but one of the things I've also found is the people. I'm also like that. I decided to finally pursue comics when I was almost 30, but so a little bit later than a lot of other people. And a big
yeah,
part of that was it. One of the things I noticed is the older generations, when they start to do it, they're the ones who already know how to work, who know how to like how look at the realistic aspects of it and
mm,
really are going to it forward.
yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm more pragmatic about it now than I would have been like if I'd started, yeah,
Yeah,
earlier.
but it's great seeing that these kids have the support. I shouldn't
Yes,
call them kids; they're in their 20s, but you know what I mean.
right. I do.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
they bring
and
the
and
energy.
like so much respect. Like
Yeah.
just yeah. So
The so I'm curious. Tell me about what you did specifically for this anthology.
right. So the thing that excited me the most with this anthology was Project Three. So Project Three was where Jack Wallace wrote a comic script and left it open to for pay folks to interpret it and and lay out panels. And like we talked about earlier, like that's my jam. I love taking somebody's writing and then like trying to visualize it. So yeah, I mean, as soon as Sydney mentioned that that was going to be the project, I was like tuned in. I was like, okay, when are they going to announce it, right? And so as soon as like I didn't even wait for the announcement in the Discord. Like
Mhm.
I'm subscribed to the newsletter for C3, and we got a sneak peek of like, oh, here's Project Three, and here's the doc for the script. I'm like, I'm on it. So yeah, so I went and I took one of the pages. If you watched Jack Wallace's interview, it's like it's a really cool premise because like the idea is that without trying to spoil too much, it's a 7-page comic, and the idea is that these two teenagers are getting introduced to the world of comics, and so like they move from genre to genre, from page to page, and so it lend itself really well to all the different artists and their different styles, telling the story. So yeah, so I had the opportunity to like jump in early and pick whichever page I wanted, and I ended up going with the horror page, which is definitely a little outside of my comfort zone because I try to like my style is kind of realistic based.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was a little outside of my comfort zone, but I was like, I mean, it was the page that really appealed to me. So yeah, so that I did that, and then later on I saw more prompts about project 2, and like doing slice of life, and like we talked about earlier, like it I had I wanted to do it, but I didn't have a good idea of like what to talk about. But then as I saw those prompts, I was like, okay, I should what so like one of the I went back and thought about like some of the strips I grew up on, and Hagar the Horrible was one of those, right?
Yeah.
So right, and so like it's great for slice of life because like it's all family dynamic and like tiny everyday things, but in the life of a Viking. So I was like, okay, I'll take that style, and so yeah, so I did another page that was like a slice of life in the style of Dick Brown, who does Hagar or did Hagar Horrible. Yeah.
Uh, it's fun. I've actually just decided to bring up your website. By the way, if anyone
Oh,
wants to see, uh, oh, bring up the link. Uh,
thank you.
yeah, Chandu has a bunch of work over at Tennety.art. And I was just looking over your work, and I'm curious about your process a bit. Because I feel like I see a lot of stuff here that's a little experimental, but you're all digital from the looks of it. Is that correct?
Um, so digital was a little later in the day for me. I mean, that
Mhm.
the website. I mean, a lot of the. I mean, it's not exhaustive. I mean, there's a lot of work that I've done that I haven't put up on there yet.
Mhm.
But yeah, any more recently, like for the last several years, I've been all digital.
Yeah.
So yeah,
What do you use? Like what software, what tech?
yeah. So I used to use a cheap tablet. Like
Mhm.
so I really wanted to like get into digital. I mean, like my whole thing was paper before. Like it was all
Mhm.
pencil, pen, and ink.
Yeah.
And so like I wanted to move digital, took a couple courses. Couldn't bring myself to splurge on like an iPad or like a Surface or anything. So I was like, okay, how can I get started, right? And the pragmatic part. So um,
Mhm.
I got a tablet that was like a plug-in, like you work on your computer and draw on
Yeah.
the side kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and it's a Huey on. I don't know if I said that right, but
Yeah. I
yeah,
love those.
yeah.
I literally have mine right here as my second screen.
Yes, if I wasn't packing all my stuff up because of
Yeah.
where my house is right now, but
Mhm.
I would have it right here too. So yeah, I started on that and with Sketchbook, which was free on the Mac, and so
Mhm.
like I couldn't believe that that was free. So, but like yeah, it was great to like get started and like learn about layers and blending modes and all those cool things. I still have like tons to learn, but I got down a process for me that worked enough that I could justify like then getting an iPad and like being more mobile. And so yeah, so now I almost exclusively use my iPad and Procreate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's always funny with the digital programs because especially if you're figuring it out on your own,
yeah,
which is also how I got started in a lot of this stuff. There are 1,000 different ways to do the exact same thing, so there's almost no wrong way to do it.
right,
Um,
exactly. Yeah, and
yeah,
I kept trolling, about how to do this, and turns out like yeah, basically you need to nail down a process that works for you,
yeah,
and it won't be, it won't work for all cases, and but at least there's consistency. and you can, yeah.
It's funny. I remember before I actually went to school and got some education on how to do this stuff, I heard somewhere that, oh, if you're going to shade stuff, use a multiply layer. That's a great way to do a lot of things. And
Yeah.
I misunderstood what they told me, and I thought you had to use multiply using the same color that is like directly
Oh.
underneath it. So every single time I was shading a different section, I was picking another color and doing it.
Oh no.
Uh,
Yeah.
I almost cried when I found out I could pick one color and just do it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
So it's funny how all these different things do it. Kelsey
Yeah.
has joined the chat, points
Oh,
out there's no wrong way to do digital art, but there's a difference between 9,800 steps and 2 steps. Yep,
this is true.
yep.
This is very true.
But yeah, it's funny how often like online sources now can help you figure this stuff out.
Yeah, this is very true.
Yeah.
So yeah, I went on Udemy, and like there's a course about color and light, and yeah, and that was my other big hang up was color. Like, I was, and if you look on my website, there's really not a lot with color in it, but so yeah, it took me a really long time, and I'm still learning a lot about it. But yeah, the multiply layer for shading is a great hack.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I use that all the time.
The advantage also though of going into it without being as familiar with color or things like that, a lot of times that's when you come up with the really interesting stuff. Just because you don't know what rules you're breaking or anything like that.
Right.
It's one of the examples that I always find interesting. I wish I could remember this cartoonist's name, but he grew up reading like the old newsprint style comics and things like that.
Yeah.
And didn't realize that the dots for like CMYK for the printing process to make color were being put there through a process. So he actually would make comics stippling all those dots and creating the craziest colors. I wish I could remember his name, but like he did that because he didn't know and just experimented with it.
That's amazing.
There's also something I kind of want to bring up and show. I'm looking at the transformation of things.
Oh yeah.
Just because I think it's a good example of one of the other big things that people don't always recognize when they start looking at digital, but is honestly just one of the things that can be really cool. And that is you have advantages of things like blur.
Yes.
And being able to do really soft colors and out of focus colors. And that's just one of those experimental things that a lot of people don't mess with as much as they really should.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Like, yeah, this piece was for, so I don't know, Canada Keck puts together a gallery show called Comics versus Art. And so this was based on a Chinese painting or Japanese. I'm so sorry. I cannot remember. But like, it's a famous painting it's called Changchu and the Butterfly. And it's just one frame of like, this one person meditating and this butterfly. But it's based on a passage about like dreaming about a butterfly. And, that passage is called The Transformation of Things. And so like the whole idea was like, this person was like, it's a whole long discussion on the nature of reality. And like, it's just a really wacky, surrealist passage. But the theme there is like, dream versus reality. And like, when I am dreaming of a butterfly and then I wake up, is it, am I actually the butterfly dreaming I'm a person? Right. And so like, I kind of wanted to, kind of blur those lines between like the structure of the comic, and like you expect the the grid to be there and like the panels to continue, and then suddenly the butterfly shows up and you're somewhere else, and then when you wake up you don't know where you are, kind of thing.
Absolutely. I also love, like, one of the things you kind of learn is that there is no entirely escaping the grid. You can do pages with no panels, and in theory the grid still exists because people will read it in a specific, following a specific path. But I really like how you make the eye go the direction it needs to based on the flight of this butterfly. Like that's some real comic nerddom I'm loving.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. I'm glad you picked up on that. Like, yeah, that was the goal. I didn't know if I had achieved it, but like, I was like, okay, the butterfly is flying, and how can I make it follow that flight without like tedious motion lines all over? So I'm like, okay, maybe I'll use the words to move that
Also,
around.
the eye looking at the butterfly that landed on it.
Yeah.
Uh, Movement between panels is always a fun thing, and you're good
Yeah.
with moving lines that actually point towards the next panel you're supposed to look at. Like this is I'm okay. I'm nerding out too much. I'm taking this down.
No, this is great. This is
Yeah,
great. I love it. Um, Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate
yeah,
it.
absolutely. But yeah, it's funny because I haven't seen it particularly in this group, but I've definitely been in comic groups where there's been a big traditional versus digital argument.
Oh
I don't
gosh,
think
yeah.
I've seen that argument yet in C3, which is kind of cool.
It is
Uh,
really cool. Yeah. I mean,
Because
there's definitely nerding out on both fronts that happens, but
oh
like, yeah,
yeah,
no, yeah, no rancor that I've seen.
yeah, I remember. I remember when I was in comic school, I had someone pitch a fit because they read a comic that used a copy pasted figure in the background, and they got genuinely offended by that. And I was
I
like,
I wouldn't get anything done if I couldn't do that.
exactly. Like there's so many shortcuts and tricks you can do with digital,
Yeah.
but it's always fun seeing people who like the blurred background thing. That's something that's almost impossible to do traditional. You could use an airbrush. You could maybe create that effect if you're watercoloring it or something like that. But
Right.
like, or you could do it digitally and it's works great.
Yeah.
I actually did it. One of my first experiments with digital comics, I did a story, a nonfiction story about me breaking my glasses. And so there were huge sections where I blurred stuff out
Oh,
because
you
I
could.
couldn't see. I tried to
Amazing.
replicate what it looked like to me.
That's cool.
And it
That's a
was just one
great
of
way
those
to tell
things.
that story.
Yeah, but it will hopefully not see the light of day because the art is awful. But
Oh, come on.
no, it's somewhere on the internet. I'm pretty sure you can find it on my website. But it's one of those things that, yeah, I always like seeing people look at what you can theoretically do with digital. Do you have the
Yeah.
problem where you zoom in and do too much detail work?
I try not to. Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah,
definitely an issue. But like, I think, setting the resolution beforehand and like, working on the iPad with like limited screen real estate, like, I think it kind of keeps me from going too far down that rabbit hole.
yeah,
Like, if I zoom in too much, I'm like, oh, this is too blurry. I shouldn't be adding detail. So zoom
yeah.
back out.
I also don't know. I don't specifically use iPads, but I
Yeah.
imagine the whole undo cycle is much less of a problem uh, when you can't just hit Control Z.
So yeah, Procreate is actually really good about that. Like it makes it really easy
Mhm.
to like undo. Like it's a gesture, so like it really leans into gestures on the iPad. Like and there's still a ton with Procreate that I don't even use. But
Yeah,
like yeah, like so undo is just like a double finger tap. And when I'm drawing on my physical paper, like I find myself tapping the paper like because I'm
yeah.
like
No, we've
I,
all done that.
right, yeah,
It's one of the main advantages of being traditional is that once you put something down, you're committed,
yeah.
which
Yeah,
actually can really help you work faster or do all kinds of stuff.
yeah.
Back when you did traditional, what did you usually use besides chalk?
Right. It was mostly pencil for a long time,
Mhm.
and then graduated to using pen and ink.
Mhm.
So yeah, there was one picture that I have that I don't have on my site, but
Mhm.
a lot of the drawings in the illustration section on my site are ink because those are from doing Inktober one year.
Mhm.
So yeah, I've enjoyed that. And there was another picture that I did a while ago, which did use the stippling technique. I mean, it was all black ink, so it wasn't like inventive color or anything. But yeah, so that's still something I enjoy.
Yeah, I think I'm also seeing colored pencil and some of that in there too.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do like color pencil. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Uh, I'm also curious because I'm seeing a lot of drawings of birds. Have you done much natural illustration in general? I'm assuming these are from photos.
They are from
Mhm.
photos. I mean, Creative Commons photos. But like, yeah, it's birds have been kind of an interest of mine for a while. Just, I mean, I've done a little bit of like illustration work for like a nature journal, but like nothing. Yeah, it was very like one off. It wasn't like a continued relationship or anything.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, I've just been interested in birds, and so like if I was like, okay, if I'm gonna, so the bird illustration that's on there, that's in color pencil.
Okay.
That one was a Christmas gift, like a holiday gift for my family. Like
Mhm.
so I was like, okay, I'm gonna just draw birds for everybody. So that's what I did one
Yeah.
year. Yeah.
That's definitely a fun one. Our Secret Santa stuff in art school was we whoever we were assigned, we had to draw them in an ugly Christmas sweater.
Oh,
Uh,
amazing. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but that feels
Speaking
like
of,
kind of that same type of energy.
yeah, yeah. Speaking of, like, I really love the Secret Santa project that we did for C3 too.
Right. I'm trying to remember what requirements we gave. We gave a color and a food and a person, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
like a photo, the color, and a favorite food. Yep, and yeah,
Yeah. It's also nice because since everyone in the group is an artist, they will appreciate receiving art, which
yeah,
is kind of a crapshoot. I actually had a problem one year where I tried to do a family illustration, a portrait illustration as the Christmas gift because I was broke at the time.
yeah.
And my parents were like, I don't like this part. Do it again. And I'm like,
Oh no,
no,
that
but no,
hurts. Yeah,
it hurts. But
yeah,
yeah, like artists, never an issue. Um,
right.
but yeah,
Yeah.
one thing I'll also just very quickly throw out: if anybody has any questions for Chandu, we are getting into about that time in the video, so go ahead and post that in the chat, and I'll make sure that it gets seen. Um, but yeah, so natural illustration and stuff like that, is that something you've thought about doing more, or was it kind of just a one-off job?
Um, I thought about that's a good question. That's a really good question. I I don't I haven't spent a lot of time like planning anything around it. Like I was like, okay, if I'm gonna do stuff for people or like, I feel like birds would be something that I'm comfortable doing. And like, because I want to get better at drawing birds because I like birds, right?
Yeah.
So that's mostly the thinking. Like beyond that, it's been fairly one off. Like a lot of my work before I got into comics was commissions, like somebody, I mean, I'd not even, I've somebody at work would leave and I would just do a drawing of them so they could keep it, or like doing it
Mhm.
for friends and family, like somebody had, you know actually there was one person in my friends and
Mhm.
family that commissioned me to actually do a portrait of like a couple for their wedding. That was like, I think, the more sizable work that I've done in that vein.
Yeah.
And But yeah, outside of that, like it was largely just like drawing, doodling around. Like I would work in the office and there would just be my post-its laying around
Yeah.
with drawings on them, and like people are like, you should do more with this, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. So yeah.
Yeah. I do want to throw out there just because I see it getting brought up in the chat. I've made my parents sound a lot more savage than they are. uh, that's like it was softer the way they said it. It just
Yeah.
was kind of a bummer. Um, so one question that got brought up, it was covered a little bit earlier, but Kelsey asks, "What got you interested in making comics?"
Yeah, so we were talking earlier, and like
Mhm.
the idea of like visualizing stories is like really appealing to me.
Mhm.
And so like comics, I mean, from influences growing up, like I
Mhm.
wasn't a huge comic collector or anything, but like
Mhm.
I loved reading comic strips. And so the idea of comics as a medium to like illustrate a story, like,
Yeah.
was a very compelling thing for me. And then of course I read,
Yeah.
the classic, like, understanding comics, and like the whole dissection of Watchmen, and like,
Mhm.
all of the things, that narrative ideas that you can take, and employ in the medium. And I'm like just super,
Yeah.
appealed by that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna take that question and turn it just a little bit, since we did cover some of that earlier.
Yeah.
Um, so you studied engineering. You did software work. You work in insurance now. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes. So I work for,
Yeah.
Beam
I'm
Benefits.
I'm curious what the moment was that made you go, it's time to now start doing comic stuff. Like you'd had interest in it for a long time, but I'm
Yeah.
curious what made you go, now's the time.
That's a good question. I don't think there was a particular moment. Like, I'd been wanting to do some stuff. Like, there was a story I wrote, and I was like, oh, this would work as a comic. But then I had no idea how to go about it. I think a lot of things kind of came together, but I think the catalyst was definitely going to space in 2015, and like just seeing a whole bunch of like indie creators, tired, like show off their stuff, and being like, yeah, this is accessible, like,
Yeah.
and it's like, there's these are folks who are like, who are working on their skill, and like who are, putting their stuff out there. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, sounds like, I can do this. And then, you know and so I started thinking about, okay,
Mhm.
what stories can I tell, and like what, but then also learning about the Scribbler,
Yeah.
and then seeing their call for submissions. I'm like, okay, I want to do this. So yeah, made a pitch to the Scribbler editors, and like, um, bought something that had been circling in my brain kind of for a while, and like they were like, yeah, let's do it. And so
Yeah.
like did that. And so like, so it was a low barrier to like have, a one-page comic, instead of like something gigantic, so yeah.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like one of the things that's funny about going to, especially if you're first starting to go into these things and you go to a show like Space, is there's a huge range of talent you see. I'm not trying to knock anybody, but you definitely see things where you go, "Oh, I could do that." Like there's definitely elements of it where you can look where, especially starting out, you can go and like, "Oh, this person's doing it. Why can't I?"
This is true. And
Yeah.
it also like is inspiring, as like, it's like strength of conviction. I'm like, they believe in their work enough to like put it out there, and like,
Yeah.
and I'm like, yeah, least I can do is like, get something out. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
also going to what you said about the Scribbler, one of the things that I've that always interests me is how constraints help.
Mm,
When you don't have to figure out, okay, how big do I make this, or how many pages is this going to be? If you're told you only get to do one page, you're like, good, okay, I can work with that.
yes. Yeah, that's very, very true.
And,
Like,
or
yeah.
stuff like you have to throw in a banana. Cool, like cool. I'll do a story that has a banana in it. I can do that.
Right. Yep. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. But especially for people starting out, if you're in the Columbus area, highly recommend looking up the Columbus Scribbler. I actually, because Jack Wallace recently was here, I can show that.
Yes. Please
Um,
do.
yeah. Also, like if you go to Space, the Small Press and Alternative Comic Expo, which happens usually at the beginning of summer or end of spring, depending on when they're able to specifically get stuff going. Um, talk to Bob Corby. He's the guy who will be right at the front, usually selling
Yep.
O Comics, because he makes O Comics, and that's another great place where you can start getting your work out there.
Yes.
Uh, and like anytime you can find these pitches, or very self-serving, follow Can Write production stuff, because I also make anthologies and you can submit pitches for that.
Yes.
Anyway, enough
Please
shilling.
do.
Um,
Yeah.
but we are getting about to the hour mark. I'm curious, is there anything else you wanted to make sure gets out there before we wrap it up?
Um, no, I mean, I would say thank you for having me, and like definitely check out the Columbus Cartoon Coalition. And also want to plug for the BIPOC anthology that happened earlier this
Mhm.
past year. And like I had a couple of pages in there too, and like that was a fantastic experience.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell us what you did for the BIPOC anthology. I should have brought that up.
No worries.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that was a little bit of a, speaking of autobio
Mhm.
comics, that was like a tough time for me because I had just gotten diagnosed with, diabetes. And so like I had to like make a huge lifestyle change, which culturally for me was really, really hard.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So yeah, so yeah, so when that call came about, like, it was like, whatever, like, we just want, to celebrate the creators, like, it can be anything you want. So I was like, okay, I'm, so I went off script, and I tried to, like, just make it, draw something that kind of communicated the grief that I was feeling,
Mhm.
without like you're saying, like, artists are self-deprecating. Like, I didn't want to be self-indulgent on there, but like just put across, what it felt like.
Yeah,
And so, like, yeah, so it's like a two-page thing, and it basically gives a brief history of, like, one line history of why certain things were important, and like when they get yanked out of your life, like, what that feels like. But it also called back to like some of the other things that keep me going, like
yeah,
carving wood, or like, other, drawing, and like,
yeah.
making comics. And so, um, yeah, I think it was just a really great way to, channel that, and like great opportunity for me to like contribute to
Yeah.
that anthology.
And it's definitely something that's worth talking about because not only is diabetes a tough diagnosis to deal with, but food is such an integral part to so many cultures
Yeah,
that having to make massive changes related to that is very difficult.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and without dwelling too much on it, but like, honestly, like, without that outlet,
Mhm.
I wasn't spending enough time like processing what I was feeling, and
Mhm.
like I felt like, I mean, there was a lot of journaling and stuff that I was doing, and so like I kind of was able to mine some of that for that. But
Yeah.
just, you know um, it was kind of liberating, and kind of, um, there was a feeling of being seen,
Yeah.
in like being saying, okay, like, you're a creator, do whatever you want,
Yeah.
and yeah.
And some it's definitely tough sometimes to find the language to express what you're feeling and things like that. I've definitely done drawings to deal with that stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
So it is a good outlet. I do also want to tap briefly on what is this about carving wood?
Oh, um that just another, so
Mhm.
yeah, so like, it's another process of bringing things into being. And
Yeah.
like, I had been interested in, doing my illustration work. One of the things I was interested in, like, was printmaking. And
Mhm.
I was like, okay, this is a really cool look. And like, I was like, okay, I guess, I learned later that people learn this stuff in like high school, or like, in elementary school. I never learned anything like this. So like,
Right.
right. And so
Yeah.
like, when I heard about printmaking, I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. And so like, I thought the only way to do it was with woodcuts, right? Like,
Mhm.
you had to carve wood.
A classic style. Yeah.
Right. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll take a class on carving wood. And then the class showed up, and I took it, and like I just really loved the idea of like just sculpting in 3D, like,
Yeah.
with so carving wood. So like, I'm not like, I don't have power tools, and I don't do like, lathes or whatever, but like I have my little gouges and knives up there, and like I take small blocks of wood and I make things with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so another rabbit hole, just a creative rabbit hole. Like, I'd never ended up, well, I guess I do some printmaking with like rubber. Now that I know that you can just use rubber and not wood.
Yeah. This is way easier to cut. What was I
Yeah,
doing? Yeah.
right, exactly. But yeah.
That I love that that's how you got into wood cutting too. Because Like I've thought woodblock printing seemed like such a cool way. Like it'd be cool to make a comic out of that. I just
Right.
don't have the patience.
Yeah, I hear you. And yeah, there's another story that I have that I have had for like several years now that,
Mhm.
the one other story to my name that, that I can talk about, that I've wanted to like publish, but I also wanted to illustrate it. And like my drawing style wasn't working for that
Mhm.
story. So part of my like motivation to learn woodcuts was, maybe as a way to like, you know illustrate that story. um yeah, still hasn't seen light of day, but someday.
Back burner projects, man, they happen.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. I think we're right around the hour mark. We're going to go ahead and do a wrap up there. Thank you very much for joining us, Chandu.
Absolutely, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Absolutely. You can find more of Chandu's work at Tennety.art. That's also your Instagram handle, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So you're able to find it there. We are doing this as part of the C3 Anthology adventure. We're getting
Yeah.
ready to launch the crowdfunder campaign in mid August for our next big anthology. You can find more information for now down at ko-fi.com/Columbus Cartoon Coalition. It is scrolling across the bottom of the screen. So there's this thing that we've been doing in a bunch of the interviews. We're basically throwing up gang
Uh-oh.
signs for
Here we
C3.
go. Let's see.
So let's get it in there. Close enough.
C3. Oh, are we doing it this way? Okay, C3.
C3.
Oh man, I wish I didn't have the blur now. There
Yeah,
we go.
there
C3.
you go. C3. We got it.
All right.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us. And until next time, everyone, rock on, guys, and never stop drawing.
All right. See y'all. Bye.